Okay, thanks, Angela. As Angela said, I'm a master's student, and within SR Interrupters group, I'm actually studying how the brain enables us to navigate and represent locations in our environment. So the particular questions we're looking at is how the brain enables us to know where we are, how does it enable us to know where we want to go, and how do we get there? Now, I fully appreciate it's 2021, and so the answer to most of these questions most of the time is we use Google Maps. But that's a pretty boring answer and doesn't really tell us that much. So our research is on how the brain enables us to answer these questions when we don't have cell phone reception. It's a pretty fascinating question. It's got serious ramifications for a wide range of behaviors for both humans and animals. And so today I'm going to present a presentation entitled Mazes, London Cabbies and Ants on Stilts. So I'm going to try and impart some of the fascinating parts of these questions and their answers that have been found so far. So we'll have a look at some of the classic experiments that have been done in the past to get us to these answers. And some of those experiments lend their name to this presentation. We'll look at the research that we're doing now in our lab, and we'll also touch on where that research might lead to in the future. So we're going to start off a long way back, so about 75 years ago. One of the earliest breakthroughs in this field was made by a scientist named Edward Tolman, and he was working with rats. So he would place rats in mazes and he would see how those rats navigated through the maze. So some of those mazes were really simple. So as you can see here, the rat would start at the bottom, they'd simply have to run up through a single pathway, and then they'd be rewarded with a food reward. So once the rats were comfortable and familiar with their environment, in one of the experiments, Tolman closed off the normal pathway. And then he gave them a series of other options which they could choose from. Now, it must be remembered to set the scene and the context that when Tolman was doing these experiments, the prominent theory on animal cognition, or how animals think, was that animals pretty much acted as pretty simple stimulus response machines. They get a response and they react almost intuitively to that response without adding a whole lot of high-level processing or that kind of processing occurring in their brains. So when Tolman gave the rats multiple alternate path options in this experiment, the prominent hypothesis, was that the rats would follow the options that are closest to the previous pathway. So in this case, options number 9 and 10. But they didn't do this. So instead, they followed pathway number 6. And the reason they did, number 5 and number 6. And the reason they did this was that would be the pathway they would travel directly to get to the food reward. So Tolman had predicted this, but most hadn't. And the reason he predicted it was that he had hypothesized that rats make what is called an internal cognitive map of their environment, so of their maze. And what this internal cognitive map allowed the rats to do was to identify the relative positions of their start point and their food reward, and to figure out the best way to get there. So what that meant was that instead of the rats just figuring out that they had to run straight and then turn left and then turn right and turn right and sort of establish a linear process to get to the food, they had a higher perspective view of what they were able to achieve. So this was a pretty surprising finding, considering a couple of things. First, the then held views regarding animal cognition, which I touched on, which suggested that no animals, let alone rats, would be able to make such a cognitive leap. And the second is when you consider the perspective that the rat has in the maze. So they have very little vision beyond where they actually are at the time. And yet they were still, once they became familiar with that maze, able to establish a perspective through the use of an internal cognitive map that enabled them to seek the direct path towards the food. So Tolman went on so far as to suggest that if rats were able to generate these internal cognitive maps, then so could other animals, including humans. And there's since been a significant amount of research into this field that tells us that humans do indeed create these maps. So even if you've never heard of these before, most of you will be familiar with the concept of a cognitive map, even if you don't know you are. So a cognitive map is what allows you to take shortcuts around a city or a school or a shopping center that you're familiar with, because you've developed an understanding of how the different elements of those environments are related to each other. You compare this to a city or a school that you're new to or that you're going to for the first time, in which you're more likely to get lost, and you're more likely to rely on either a map or a few well-worn paths between certain points, regardless of whether they are the most direct way or not. So the next obvious question to a neuroscientist is that if humans and animals generate these cognitive maps to help them navigate their environment, then how does the brain enable the creation and use of these maps? And we now know that in mammals and some birds at least, that these maps are enabled by specialized neurons in the hippocampus. So the hippocampus has been mentioned multiple times so far today. But what's special about these particular neurons in the hippocampus is that their firing rate, which as has been mentioned, is the way that nerves share information with neurons share information with other neurons. That firing rate varies based on navigational related concepts. So in some of those cells, the firing rate varies based on where we are. In others, it's on how fast we're moving. And there are also cells where the firing rate varies depending which direction we're going. So this is pretty incredible, right? Because it means that there are particular neurons in the brain that only fire when you're in a particular place. So you might have a navigation cell that fires only when you're in the kitchen, or only when you run past a certain spot as you're running around the lake. It also means that by having cells that change their firing rates based on either how fast we're going or the direction we're going, then we have the equivalent of a speedometer and a compass inside our brains that enable us to navigate through these cognitive maps that we've developed. So identifying these particular cells greatly impacted our understanding of how the brain enables us to navigate. So much so that 3 of the scientists who first found these cells were awarded the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 2014. So as I said, these cells were found mostly in mice and rats initially in the hippocampus. So hippocampus has been mentioned a few times today. It's 2 small regions deep in either hemisphere, in each hemisphere of the brain. And it's so named apparently because it looks like a seahorse. And hippo is the Latin word for horse. So when these navigation cells were found in the hippocampus for the first time, the hippocampus was already known to play a significant role in memory, solidifying the memories so that we can recall them in the future. Once these cells were found, though, the scientists took another look at the hippocampus, now not just as a center of memory, but also of navigation abilities. So this led to research in animals, including the tree squirrel and the scrub jay, that cache their food. So caching is where animals collect food during the summer or the autumn when it's available, and hide it in multiple different spots so that they can retrieve it in the winter when there's no fresh food available. So caching is a really navigationally challenging behavior, because it requires animals to both remember multiple different cache sites and also to be able to navigate back to those sites, even if the environment has changed dramatically. So there might be a foot of snow there that wasn't there before, and they still have to find their caches. And if they don't find their caches, they starve and die. So the research found that these animals that cache their food had significantly larger hippocampi than those of similar and related species that didn't cache their food. So this suggested that the hippocampi of these caching animals was larger to provide them with the better navigational abilities required for this behavioral strategy. So having obtained evidence that cells in the hippocampus in many animals enable these cognitive maps and navigation, the obvious question is whether this was also true in humans. So research into this question would require humans performing a navigation-related task and an ability to measure the effects of this task on the brain without, for obvious reasons, using invasive means. And one of the most successful of these experiments was an investigation into London cab drivers. So to be authorised to drive a London cab, prospective drivers must learn what is known as the knowledge. So this knowledge is defined by the guidebook, which is issued to prospective cabbies as a thorough knowledge, primarily, of the area within a 6-mile radius of Charing Cross, all the streets, housing estates, parks and open spaces, government offices and departments, financial and commercial centres, diplomatic premises, town halls, registry offices, hospitals, places of worship, sports stadiums, leisure centres, airline offices, stations, hotels, clubs, theatres, cinemas, museums, art galleries, schools, colleges, universities, police stations, headquarters, buildings, civil, criminal, coroners, courts, prisons, and places of interest to tourists. In fact, anywhere a taxi passenger might ask to be taken. So on first blush, this seems like a pretty difficult task, but that difficulty is amplified by the fact that this task is being conducted in the City of London, and that makes it harder for 2 reasons. Firstly, London is a really old city. So it was first founded by the Romans in about 47 AD, which means that it's been growing in size and complexity for almost 2,000 years into the huge and complex city it is today. Secondly, unlike other large modern cities, London streets were never organised on a grid system like Manhattan has been, nor has London at any time been significantly replanned or reorganised in the way that some other old cities, such as Paris, have been. Together, this means that London now has one of the most complicated road networks of any city in the world. The area that London cabbies are required to learn, as defined in the knowledge, is shown in this diagram with the red circle and incorporates more than 25,000 streets. The inner area, shown by the black square here and highlighted here, shows that those streets are, to this day, poorly organised, they're claustrophobic, and they're notoriously bad for traffic. So learning the knowledge takes most applicants about 3 to 4 years, and only about 50% of those applicants actually pass the tests and end up being London cab drivers. So how does this relate to our topic? Well, this is obviously an extremely difficult navigation task. And so researchers, starting in about 2000, wanted to see if learning the knowledge would change the structure of human brains, i.e. would have the same effect that being a caching animal has on some squirrels and some birds. And it turns out that it does. So MRIs of the applicants showing that the posterior part of the hippocampus, which is the part of the hippocampus closest to the back of the brain and shown in blue here, the posterior hippocampus grew in size over the periods that the applicants were learning the knowledge. What's more, the applicants that didn't successfully pass the knowledge tests were shown to have less of this growth than those that did. So this all suggested that the hippocampi of the applicants that were successful had expanded to accommodate the demands of generating the cognitive maps of the detail and complexity required to navigate London streets. So this is a pretty impressive instance of not only demonstrating that the hippocampus plays a large role in navigation in humans, but also provides evidence that these navigation abilities aren't necessarily hardwired. So they can be learned and improved with effort, which gives hope to those of us who get lost in the Canberra Centre, for example, regularly. It also provides a startling example of what's known as neuronal plasticity, which is the term given to the ability of the brain and the nervous system more generally to reorganise its structure, its function, or its connections based on internal or external stimuli. So in this case, the structure of the hippocampus was changed, it was enlarged in response to a difficult navigational task. So we now know that we create cognitive maps in our brains of areas that we are familiar with, and that we have specialised neurons in the hippocampus that enable us to establish these maps and to navigate through them. And this leads us closer to the area of research that we're looking at, and that is how do navigation cells, whose firing rates change depending on where they are, know where they are? How do they? What information do they use to determine these firing rates? And it turns out there are two main categories of information that we use. The first is information from our senses. So we humans, perhaps not surprisingly, are heavily dependent on vision to navigate. We can also use information from our other senses, including our hearing and our sense of smell, to assist us in navigation, even in some instances where we don't realise that we're doing so. When we look at more broadly across the animal kingdom, however, we see a bewildering array of senses being used to inform navigation. Some of them are familiar to us, and some of them seem almost otherworldly. So research has shown that a huge number of animals can use the sun to navigate. This includes animals you'd expect, like birds and butterflies and bees, but also animals like ants and even some fish. We also know that honeybees and some birds, including pigeons, can use the polarization of the sunlight to navigate. At night time, when sunlight isn't available, some migratory birds are known to identify the North Star and navigate by that. And this photo is from an experiment in which birds were placed inside a planetarium. And then the location and the organization of the stars shown on the planetarium's roof was changed to try and identify how that would affect the direction that the birds try to flew. And it turns out it was the North Star that they were identifying. Even more amazingly, dung beetles of all animals have been shown to use the location of the Milky Way as a reference point during their navigation. So it's animals such as bats, dolphins, and orcas have all been shown to use echolocation to understand their environment and inform their cognitive map, while pigeons and some mole rats use magnetoreception, which is a sensitivity to the Earth's magnetic field to inform their navigation. So that's information from our senses. The second type of information we use to navigate is that which comes from our own bodily processes. So this includes using information about the amount of energy we've used and even the number of steps we've taken to determine either our rate of travel or distance of travel. And one of the ways we know this is through the last experiment I want to talk about in detail. So in the 1980s, researchers started looking at desert ants. and how they navigate. So these ants live in the Sahara Desert, and they travel fairly long distances in a really featureless environment to forage for food. Once they finish their foraging, they're able to return in a straight line directly back to their nest, regardless of the route they've taken on the way out. So this is pretty impressive, noting how, as I said, featureless the environment is in which they're foraging. So scientists have previously discovered that ants use celestial cues, i.e. the stars, to orient themselves and figure out their direction of travel. But they didn't know how they calculated how far they have traveled. And you need both a direction and a distance to be able to then identify where you are in relation to your home and to get back to the home in a straight line. So the researchers did something pretty interesting, which you can probably guess if you remember the title of this presentation. They put stilts on some of the ants. So specifically, they captured a nest of the ants. They let the ants forage out to about 10 meters from the nest, recaptured the ants, and then on some of those ants, they temporarily glued stilts to each of their legs, as you can see in the red. They then watched and saw how the ants, both with and without stilts, were able to make their way back to their nest. So it turns out that the ants with stilts were able to head directly in exactly the correct direction back to their nest. However, they got their distance estimation all wrong. So they went way past their nest before they started doing their searching behaviors for the entrance to the nest. And the reason they did this, as was hypothesized by the researchers, was that they were effectively counting the number of steps they needed to take before they would find their nest. And when you put stilts on their legs, each of those steps is longer than they're used to. So whereas 100 steps will get them to where they wanted to go, 100 steps with stilts will get them way past where they wanted to go. So this suggests that the ants are actually using information from the number of steps they took as a measurement of distance. It's since been demonstrated that in some circumstances, humans will do something very similar, using an estimate of the number of steps to determine how far they've traveled. And again, this can happen subconsciously. So it's not something whereby we need to actually count out our steps. So together, research into the information we use has highlighted that humans and animals can make use of a bewildering array of information sources to inform our cognitive map and our navigation through that map. And this, like all good scientific results, has led to even more questions. And the most obvious of which is, how do we combine these information sources? And then this brings us to what we're studying in our lab. So we know that any task that requires the combination of multiple sources of information is a difficult one. We also know that level of difficulty is amplified when those information sources can disagree with each other, when there can be discrepancies between those information sources. And these two statements really accurately describe the navigation tasks that we're talking about. In the senses and the information that we use, such as vision, can be easily distorted, as we've all seen before. And this includes in ways that can affect our ability to use them for navigation. So humans, we know, will regularly over or underestimate distances that are either steeply uphill or steeply downhill, while our perception of effort and our perception of distance traveled changes depending on whether we're carrying a load or not, and if we are, then how heavy that load is. Distortions also affect the sensory information that animals use. So magnetic field anomalies occur frequently across the Earth, which distorts information used in magnetoreception. Noise can interrupt echolocation, both above the surface of the Earth for bats and below the water surface for marine mammals, while cloud cover can obviously interrupt or distort visual cues from the sun or the stars. So all of this means that our brain must have the ability to not only combine multiple sources of inputs, but also decide which ones are correct. Also, it can accurately determine where we are and where we need to go. And the costs of getting this wrong can sometimes be hard to overstate. So to give an example, and it's an extreme example, sure, but it's still an example. The Arctic tern is a bird about the size of a peewee, so not a large bird at all. Each year, the tern travels from the Arctic down to the Antarctic and back. So that's two 15,000 kilometre journeys each year. Now, if you imagine you're the Arctic tern, you're flying 15,000 Ks from literally the top to the bottom of the world, and your internal navigation system is trying to combine all this information to get there accurately. So if your internal direction calculations are off by as little as 1 degree, you're going to end up about 250 kilometers away from where your intended destination. Now, for these birds, that can be enough to miss their breeding areas or their eating areas, both of which are obviously going to be catastrophic. So this tells us that our brain has some pretty nimble and some very accurate algorithms to compare information sources, identify how reliable they are, and then either combine them or discard them. And while we know that our brains can do this, there's evidence obviously that they can, we don't have a really good idea yet as to how that's done. And that is what we're looking at in our lab. So in our lab, we have an environment in which mice run on a treadmill and are presented with two sources of information. The first is a virtual reality display of a maze shown on screens in front of them. And the maze is not too dissimilar to the ones that Tolman was using 75 years ago, just now virtual. And the second source of information is airflow that's blown over their whiskers. Now, both that airflow and the mouse's movement through the virtual maze are tied to their speed on the treadmill. So as they run faster, the airflow is faster, and so is their movement through the maze. We then give the mouse a really simple distance measuring task. So effectively, the mouse has to travel a prescribed distance that they get taught, and then they stop, and then they receive a reward. So once they're familiar and comfortable with that task, we start to get a bit dastardly, and we start to distort the information that's provided to the mouse. So we can either speed up or slow down the airflow over the mouse's whiskers with respect to the speed the mouse is moving, all the same for the visual display. So previous research that's just provided mice with a visual information in a similar task has shown that if you accelerate the visual stimulus, then the mouse will think they've traveled further than they have, and they'll stop short. Conversely, if you slow the stimulus down, then the mouse won't think they've traveled as far as they have, and they'll go further than they actually need to, a bit like the ants on the stilts. What's really interesting to us, though, is when you give the mouse multiple different stimulus and you distort those stimulus independently, how is the mouse able to cope with that? Is the mouse able to figure out that one of those stimulus is correct and should be paid attention to and the other one's not? Does the mouse have a preference as to which stimulus it's always going to pay attention to, regardless of whether it's accurate or not? Does the mouse combine information from those two sources to come to sort of some kind of middle ground and use that? So these are the questions that we're trying to ask, and hopefully trying to get answers from measuring the mouse's response as we change the information they're provided. And together, the answers will hopefully get us a step closer to understanding how this information is combined in the brain to enable us to navigate through the world. So the obvious question at this point is why we're doing this research. I think it's incredibly interesting. Hopefully now you do too. But it's not immediately obvious that trying to make a mouse get lost in a maze is the most worthwhile research you can do. After all, we're not trying to find the cure for the causes to multiple sclerosis, or as Becky just described, finding better ways of identifying Parkinson's disease cures, as some of the lab groups are. But I'd argue that as well as gaining a better understanding what is a really critical function of the brain, there are also a couple of downstream benefits that we'll hopefully be contributing to if we can get the answers that we're looking for. So the first application is artificial intelligence, and in particular, implementations such as self-driving vehicles. So these vehicles are a really interesting analogy of the navigation and sensory information problem that I've just been talking about. So like humans and animals, they rely on multiple different sources to determine where they are and where they're going. And whereas we use the sensory sources I've listed, so eyesight or magnetoreception or echolocation, autonomous vehicles use radar, they use LiDAR, use GPS, they use a whole bunch of different sensors. But like the sensors that we rely on, these individual sensors can each individually be confused or provide incorrect information, meaning that like our brain, the processors controlling this vehicle must be able to, in real time, combine this sensory information accurately so that the car knows where it is and where it's going. So this is currently a hugely processor-intensive problem. And not like many current instances of AI, it requires not just a huge amount of information in real time, but also a huge amount of training before the algorithms used are accurate enough to be employed in something as critical as the navigation of a car. If you contrast this with the algorithms in our brain, they run on comparatively little power, and except in extreme circumstances, like the London Cabbie example, require no specific training at all to fairly accurately navigate us through the world. So you can see why, noting that, insight into how our brain performs these feats would be really interesting to developers of the algorithms that support self-driving vehicles, and really any other role that requires multiple sources of information to be integrated together. The other potential implication of our research is with regards to Alzheimer's disease, which Becky has just touched on. So as she mentioned, navigation is one of the first faculties to be affected by Alzheimer's. And this recognition has led to recent demonstrations that navigation abilities and a measure of the impediments to these abilities might actually be able to use as an early diagnosis tool of Alzheimer's disease. Being as how these abilities are impeded really early on in the procession of the disease, they might even be able to diagnose earlier than other current tools. So the diagnosis tool currently being developed in this paradigm is actually a computer game in which it's entitled Sea Hero Quest, and it requires participants to save an old sailor's memory by sailing a boat around desert islands and across oceans. So what the researchers are doing is they're analysing the way that participants with and without Alzheimer's navigate the boat through these oceans and between these islands. And they're establishing profiles of the navigation abilities and the navigation tendencies of participants with and without Alzheimer's. And the hope is that if they can develop these profiles to enough fidelity, they may be able to use them to categorize people whose condition is not known into either the Alzheimer's or the non-Alzheimer's category, and therefore act as an early diagnosis tool. But for all that we know, the navigation skills are affected by Alzheimer's. We don't really have a good understanding as to why that is the case. So as Becky showed, we know that the hippocampus is affected by Alzheimer's fairly significantly, but we don't know whether we don't know exactly the nature of the effect on the navigation skills. So we don't know whether the cognitive map is affected, the information coming into that map, the algorithms that are used to combine those different sources, or at the neuronal level, we don't know whether the navigation cells that I spoke about earlier, whether they're simply affected earlier than other neurons, or whether they're more susceptible than other neurons to slight disruptions. So these questions in part stem from our incomplete understanding of the Alzheimer's disease itself, as Becky covered, but they also come from our incomplete understanding of the navigation systems. So it's hoped that improved understanding of the navigation processes will help our understanding of why Alzheimer's affects them so early and so badly. And it may even improve our understanding of Alzheimer's, the disease itself. So that's it. We've come on a bit of a journey over 75 years. So we've looked at the fact that we now know that we develop a cognitive map of our environment that we're familiar with, and that we use these cognitive maps to navigate our way through our environment really efficiently. We've learned these cognitive maps are enabled by specific cells in our hippocampi with firing rates that are dependent on navigation-related parameters, such as where we are, how fast we're moving, or which direction we're facing. And we've looked at the multiple different information sources that we use to inform these cells and therefore our cognitive map. The work that we're doing is looking at how we combine those information sources to ensure that we get the most accurate cognitive map and representation of our environment that we possibly can. So thanks very much for listening. Thank you to everyone who's organised the day, and thanks to Ehsan and Matt, my supervisors, and everyone else in the lab for providing all the support so far. So happy to take questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Kurt. That was very interesting and a very insightful talk as well. So there are a couple of questions. I just wanted to throw in a bit of a silly question there first, if people don't mind. I was just wondering how they went about removing the stilts from these ants, or did they just kind of squash the ant?
So I think there was a bit of both. The glue they used apparently was a non-permanent glue, but at the same time, I'm not sure that all the ants got through it unscathed, unfortunately.
Anyway, we'll move on to some real questions. So Reese says, great talk, Kurt. You mentioned that the perception of distance in human travel can be warped by increasing carrying weight or moving up and down hills. In human populations that commonly locomote substantial differences and carry large amounts of weight, does the brain have the ability to develop an understanding of these new parameters and consequently correct for the error if walking long distances up or down hills, for example?
That's a really good question. And the short answer is I don't know. The slightly longer answer is that, like most of the sources of information that we use, it's rare that we use only that one source. So even if you look at the Kalahari Bushmen or the Indigenous Australians that still do walk over long distances, it's still pretty rare that the only information they have is how far they've walked. So what generally happens is they use that as one piece of information, and they use the external sensory environment and any information they can glean from that to figure out how far they've gone or how far they need to go. I honestly don't know if work has been done to see whether those specific whether we can specifically learn to adapt to account for those type of distortions just on a singular sensory basis.
Yeah.
Sorry, Reese.
Very interesting. And I suppose being, as you mentioned, it's all of this goes on quite unconsciously. So you could ask the people that do this, and I'm sure they'd have no idea how they do it, but they certainly do. So we've got a few other questions here. So is there a defined neurological basis for differences in senses of direction between people? So in other words, is there a correlation between a larger hippocampus and a better sense of direction?
So that's one of the things that the London Cabby experiment tried to draw out. So there's actually, I kind of simplified it there. There were a number of experiments that they did. So the first one was just looking at the size of the hippocampus at the end of the process. And they showed that the people who graduated to become London Cabbies actually had a larger hippocampus than the general population. And once they realized that, they then went back and did another study over the whole period of which they were learning the knowledge, and showed that there was actually a growth over that period of time. And they, as I said, showed that the group that didn't successfully complete the knowledge test, they didn't show the same amounts of growth. So this is one of those difficult things where it's a well-established correlation now, is that you can grow your hippocampus, and as it does, you will end up with better or stronger navigational abilities. But because we're not throwing probes inside people's brains, it's really just that correlation. So, but as I said, it does show that for the people who successfully learned that knowledge, they had improved their navigational abilities across that period of time. And with that, they saw the growth in the hippocampus size. So I don't know if we've done work in humans that correlate the size of hippocampus to navigational abilities, but there is that work that shows that as you improve your abilities, that the hippocampus does grow in correlation.
Awesome. There's a few more questions. I'll just jump to one which is kind of directly relevant to that one, which is from William. And he asks, has there been any research into the size of the hippocampus within the generation that is now growing up with GPS?
Yeah, there has. There's been some early work. And again, that's it's a really difficult kind of research, like most research in humans, because you have to kind of separate the use of GPS in one group as compared to a group that's not using GPS. To try and identify whether that is the particular cause of the differences they're seeing. So again, I don't know if there's been research into the size of the hippocampus, but there has been research into the ability of people that rely on GPS and Google Maps and that kind of stuff to navigate when they don't have that. And it is diminished compared to those who don't use GPS at all. But the good news is that research also showed that you can fix that up pretty quickly. So if you either stop using it, or if you make efforts to actually engage with your environment more, to identify the kind of landmarks that you would use if you're not using GPS, whether it be really obvious intersections or a particular building, or even the location of the sun and the direction of shadows, if you do that, then you can regain the abilities that you've lost. So it basically means that day to day, we're not as good at navigating as we used to be because we don't need to be. We've offloaded that cognitive requirement into our phones, but we can regain that pretty quickly, is what some of the research showed, which is good news.
Not all hope is lost in that respect.
No.
So there's one more on the hippocampal sort of factors. So from Sydney, is it known what factors can influence things like the rate of hippocampus growth for the potential taxi drivers?
It's not known by this guy. I honestly don't know, to tell you the truth. I don't have a good answer for that. No, so as I said, what I do know is that when you compare species, the hippocampus size differs depending on how navigation-based their behaviours are, but I don't know about what the factors are that influence the rate of growth. There's also still questions about what that growth actually represents at the neuronal level, so whether it's spacing between the neurons, whether it's an increased number of microglia, whether it's increased connectivity between the navigation-related cells. So there's still some unanswered questions there as to what that actual growth means. When we say the hippocampus is bigger, why is it bigger? Are there more things in there? If so, what type of things are there more of, or are there bigger gaps between those things? So those questions are still partly outstanding as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. Cool. And I think then that brings us to the very last question, if you're happy to take one more. It's from Zaina. She's wondering if you could explain sort of what is an adaptable mental map.
I don't know that I can. I'm not familiar with that phrase. If Zaina can provide a bit more information, happy to try and help.
I maybe pronounced it a bit wrongly, but yeah, that person will
Yeah.
rescue.
But it's not, no, it's not a term that I'm familiar with. Sorry. So I can try and make something up, but that probably wouldn't be particularly helpful.
Fair enough. We'll give them a moment just to make sure there's